very much a radical phase. The Terror, Robespierre, and some of his ideals, although were put awfully into practice, were in principle quite radical versus the King Louis absolute monarchy, total power of the nobility, total power of the clergy. Like, it was somewhere in between those two styles of government, Napoleon's governing method. He set up an efficient method of tax collection, established a national banking system in order to improve and steady the economy. He ensured the government a steady supply of tax money. These actions promoted some pretty sound financial management, which is good. He dismissed corrupt public officials, and he provided the government with trained officials that set up lycées, or government-run public schools. And then those people in the lycées, if they did well, not if they had good family connections, they would go on to then work in the government. So there was a kind of a meritocracy under Napoleon's France. One area where Napoleon disregarded some of what happened with the revolution was religion. Both the clergy and many peasants wanted to restore the position of the church in France. Responding to their wishes, Napoleon signed a little bit of an agreement or concordat with Pope Pius. This established a new relationship between the church and state. So the government recognized the influence of the church. People could go to church, but the church was not getting anywhere near executive power like it had under King Louis. Napoleon thought his greatest work was a comprehensive system of laws called the Napoleonic Code. This gave the country a uniform set of laws, eliminating many injustices. However, it actually limited liberty and promoted order and authority over individual rights. And some of the freedom of speech and press established during the revolution were restricted under the code, and the code also did, unfortunately, restore slaveries in some of the French colonies of the Caribbean. So then, after he did all that, he crowned himself emperor, and he went to war. First he tried to conquer Haiti. That did not work out very well. Then he turned his attention to Europe. And, he started off a lot of successful battles, and the only really main battle he lost was Trafalgar at this point, this early successful career. This naval defeat was more important than all of his victories on land. That's because the battle took place in 1805 off the southwest coast of Spain. The British commander, Horatio Nelson, split the larger French fleet, capturing many ships. And that really ensured the dominance of the British Navy for like 100 years, because there was no real competitor with the French Navy, because that pretty much it took them away, cut them out, and so the French were on top. During the first decade of the 1800s, Napoleon's victory had given mastery over most of Europe, including the only areas actually free from Napoleon's control, to give you a better idea of it, were Britain, Portugal, Sweden, and the Ottoman Empire, which is again Austria. In addition to the lands of the French Empire, Napoleon also controlled numerous supposedly independent countries. Those included Spain, and Poland, what's modern-day Poland, and a number of German kingdoms in Central Europe. These rulers were pretty much appointed by Napoleon, and were some members of his family even. He was very much in power, but the French Empire was unstable. He was really only to maintain it at its peak from 1807 to 1812. Then he started making some mistakes. One was the Continental System. That was the blockade, a forcible closing of ports to prevent all trade and communication from Great Britain to other nations. The Great Britain, though, had a much better navy, so they were ending up pretty much easily able to skirt past the blockade and continue to work. But in retaliation, they established their own blockade, which really crippled France because it was actually good. So that's how it worked, pretty much for them with the Continental System. Then the Peninsular War took place. He made a second costly mistake in an effort to get Poland to accept this blockade. They weren't really doing it because they had to, in order to have a successful economy trade with Britain. He sent an invasion force, Napoleon did, through Spain, to get to Portugal. Just geographically, think of how that works. This outraged the Spanish people and made them a lot more united. They were pretty much like 4 or 5 states at that point, and they weren't really that put together. The Spanish were very Catholic, and they were worried Napoleon would attack the church on his way over, because his army was not only there to just walk through and get right out. You got to understand, they were sucking up all the resources with the peasants and just the people of Spain wherever they went. So the Spanish people were like, ugh, that's not good at all. Got a real problem. So for 6 years, the bands of Spanish peasant fighters, known as guerrillas, struck at French armies in Spain. Napoleon lost about 300,000 men during this Peninsular War, which is very bad. Then Napoleon made his real mistake, which was invading Russia. Even though Alexander had become Napoleon's ally, Russian Tsar refused to stop selling grain to Britain because they needed Britain's resources in return to supply their people with food and all that resources during their very cold winters that they had. So in June of 1812, Napoleon and his grand army, 420,000 troops, marched into Russia. So then, as Napoleon advanced, Alexander burned everything behind him in a scorched earth policy. So Russians practiced, they burned all the livestock, they burned all the grain, they slaughtered the livestock, they didn't burn the livestock, but they burned all the grain fields, nothing for the enemy to eat, and then they got to Moscow. And the Tsar Alexander just burned Moscow to the ground, so they couldn't stay there. They couldn't get all the resources out of Moscow, and Napoleon made the great mistake of staying in Moscow from September to October, and that was a big deal. So yeah, they decided to head back in October, and the Russians then were ready to attack. So it was very cold, very awful conditions. The French army was completely worn down. They had nothing really to eat, and yeah, they only lost about 97% of their men, which was a very big deal. As Napoleon's enemies seized on this incredible weakness, Britain, Russia, Prussia, and Sweden joined forces against him. Austria also declared war on Napoleon, despite his marriage to Marie Louise, who was an Austrian associated royal. Napoleon suffered defeat. He got up to Elba. Then 100 days. Then soon after, he escaped, and for 100 days, he returned, and he was very, very popular. He was welcomed back to France, like, hey, this is the best. And crowds of people were swarming him, and he was just very, very popular when he returned from Elba, which was this island that the British and Russia and Prussia all sent him off to. And then he returned, and it didn't go so well for him. He lost at the village of Waterloo in Belgium. So he was fighting the British army. It was working out pretty well. Then the Prussian army arrived, and that pretty much that did it for Napoleon's exhausted troops, and they chased them down the field. So Napoleon's final bid for power over. It was called the 100 Days. That's what you need to know. This is the point after he escaped from Elba. Then he pretty much got exiled again to a much less pleasant island, St. Helena, which is a remote island in the South Atlantic. He lived a lonely exile there for 6 years and died of stomach cancer. Then, back in France, we get to our final point, which is the Congress of Vienna. So Metternich of Prussia was met with one of the representatives of was met with representatives from the five powers of Europe, which is France. They sent a clergyman to go meet with France, and they also sent people from the powers of Europe, which included Russia, Prussia, Austria, Great Britain, and France. So yeah, by far though, the most influential guy was Austria. The Austrian prince, which is Metternich. Clemens von Metternich is his full name. So yeah, he distrusted the democratic ideals. He was like, this whole French Revolution thing, we don't like it at all, and we are going to take some steps to get rid of this. We're bringing back the Bourbons. This was the King Louis XVI family. They got his brother on the throne, who was still kicking at that time, and they also took some steps to make the countries around France stronger. The former Austrian Netherlands and Dutch Republic were united to create the Kingdom of the Netherlands. 39 German states were loosely joined together now created the German Confederation, which was pretty much controlled by Austria. Switzerland was recognized as an independent nation, and the Kingdom of Sardinia was strengthened by the addition of Genoa. So this pretty much created a balance of power so that no country could overrun each other and things would be peaceful at last. And most importantly, they go back to the way they are, back to the good old days before the revolution and all those pesky ideals of democracy. Were they be able to keep it that way? Only time will tell. But the answer, I think, is no. That concludes our Global podcast. Have a great test. Do well. Thank you so much for listening.